doomsday predictions were not realised.
1 month before Bush invaded Iraq, his foreign minister met with Australia's in Seoul.
Iraq's weapons of mass destruction.
2 days later, Downer wrote a letter to Prime Minister John Howard. This letter was only declassified a year ago, and in it, there was one bit that I genuinely didn't see coming. The letter deals with something called Phase 4, essentially rebuilding Iraq after Saddam Hussein was dealt with. And in it, Downer mentions his conversation with Powell, suggesting that America would relegate the United Nations to just a minor role in the rebuild. That's not the bit that got me. It's the fact that Downer rightfully identified that the rebuild wouldn't work without the so-called cover of the UN approving the invasion. Now, it's no secret that America viewed the UN as nothing more than a rubber stamp, but that Downer would be so blazing about it that he called what was really supposed to be a binding institution as nothing more than cover, showed that Australia was well aware of the state of play. A month later, Howard joined America in the invasion, and Downer publicly insisted that if the UN were to join, they wouldn't be under the thumb of America. Something we now know that he knew wasn't actually true. So why did Howard still go ahead with supporting the invasion?
Australia does not believe that all of the heavy lifting on something like this should be done by the United States and the United Kingdom alone.
Don't worry. This isn't going to be yet another video about Bush bad.
It's time to get out of Iraq, Bush. What were you even doing there in the first place, Bush? You didn't even get properly elected, Bush.
To be honest, his Texan charm has kind of made me redirect my attention elsewhere, to John Howard and to Australia. Now, on the surface, one might say, well, the illegal nature of Iraq was really an American thing. And as their southern regional managers, we really were tied to whatever head office wanted. And I do have some sympathy for that argument. I mean, just have a look at how a recent Prime Minister spoke about the alliance.
ANZUS is the foundation stone of Australia's national security.
But we act like there's two letters who don't exist in the ANZUS alliance, NZ. And New Zealand didn't participate in the invasion of Iraq. Not to mention that the Labor opposition in Australia also never supported the invasion.
On occasions, friends do disagree, as we did on this side with you on the war in Iraq.
So this was a Howard decision. And despite knowing that the invasion was doomed to failure, he proceeded anyway. Why? Well, let's just start with the public rationale that he gave in 2003.
We are determined to join other countries to deprive Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
According to Howard, though Saddam had no involvement with 9/11, his history of supporting Palestinian groups that offered violent resistance attacks to Israel presented a huge risk. Ever since he invaded Kuwait in 1990, Saddam had been an international outcast at the orders of America. With nothing to lose and with an alleged arsenal of chemical, biological, and possibly nuclear weapons, the prospect of Saddam existing in a post-9/11 world was a risk too great to bear. But we can be confident that WMDs wasn't the real reason as to why Howard was so supportive of Iraq. I mean, he says it himself. In his autobiography, Howard wrote this: "In the prelude to March 2003, I and my colleagues carefully argued the case that Saddam had WMDs. Never far beneath the surface was, however, the alliance dimension of the decision." Something you might not realize was that Howard was literally in Washington during 9/11. On September the 10th, Howard had a barbecue with Bush where they also discussed free trade. This was what the Australian Parliament looked like at the time. In order to form a government, Howard relied on the support of these guys, the Nationals. In other words, the Farmers' Party. America had notoriously tariffed foreign beef, dairy, and sugar, which meant that the Nationals' voters and donors couldn't really get a foothold in a massive export market. And think about it, no other country was as elusive for farmers. Other countries with big populations had either vegetarian diets, worse purchasing power, or simply just ate way less. In other words, Wendy's could probably prop up all of Queensland's sugar farmers by themselves. However, just months after getting inaugurated in 2001, Bush contacted Howard about the possibility of a free trade deal, and in September, this was a topic of conversation. So when you look at Howard's specific set of circumstances, there is an extent to which you can understand the pressure he might have felt to prove his loyalty to America. But I also think that Howard's literal presence in America during 9/11 somewhat shaped his immediate reaction. He offered his support to whatever course of action that America wanted to take, and said that it was time for a 100% ally and not a 70 or 80% one. Now, if you don't know the geopolitical game of the early 2000s, Al-Qaeda was quickly suspected of being behind the attacks, and they were being harbored here in Afghanistan by the Taliban government. Saddam had nothing to do with the attacks. So you would expect that when Congress met on September the 12th, that Afghanistan would be the dominant conversation. Well, something you might not know was that on that very day, Howard was actually due to give an address to Congress, but for obvious reasons he got bumped and he was forced to watch in the gallery. However, Congress still gave him a standing ovation and Howard was able to talk to them afterwards. He later wrote this: "There was a latent feeling amongst many that a mistake had been made in 1991 in not finishing off Saddam after the liberation of Kuwait." On the exact same date 1 year later, another foreign player was invited to Congress, Bibi.
There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No question whatsoever.
Netanyahu's Israel had been in a proxy war with Iraq for decades, and each had funded rebel groups and enemies of each other. In hindsight, Netanyahu was clearly trying to redirect the 9/11 conversation towards Iraq and raised alarms about the prospect of this repeating itself at the hands of Saddam. When it comes to foreign policy, we often talk about leaders as purely rational people making completely calculated decisions that serve their country's best interest. But I also think that you can't actually underestimate the power of emotional context. Howard was in the thick of 9/11, and all his surrounding voices kept associating it with Iraq. When Howard returned to Australia, he insisted that the ANZUS Treaty be invoked to offer support to whatever course of action America wanted to take. Bush proceeded to dislodge the Taliban, at least for 20 years, and launched a search party for Osama bin Laden, who had fled from Afghanistan to Pakistan. And in 2002, Bush was still yet to touch Iraq. As speculation grew that he would end up proceeding with an invasion, this was how Howard responded.
I've said that I think it's more probable than not that the Americans will do something, and that if that happens, they will approach Australia, but that hasn't happened.
We're not going to be their only mate there, though, are we?
We're talking hypothetically.
But in 2002, Australia itself became a target of terror. At the end of a footy season, teams often go on what's called a Mad Monday trip, and for obvious reasons, Bali was the most common destination. In October of 2002, 3 bombs went off in nightclubs, killing 202 victims, 88 of whom were Australians. This was over double the native Indonesian death toll, and given the timing, it was a clear targeted attack of Australia. The bombers were a group called JI, and they were supported by Al-Qaeda, with bin Laden himself even saying that this was because Australia supported America in invading Afghanistan, and for supporting East Timor in their quest for independence from Indonesia, and in doing so, breaking it off from the Muslim world since 1999.
This country was a terrorist target long before we entered the campaign in Iraq. Bin Laden criticised us for our liberation of East Timor.
To put it crudely, we hadn't even set foot in Iraq, and yet we were still a target. In Howard's mind, we'd been pushed into one of 2 options: relent and show that we can be pushed around, or flex our military muscle even if it's against the people who weren't responsible for the attack. One of the other interesting dimensions to Iraq was that the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair was a massive supporter of the invasion, even though he was from the Labour Party, who were pretty opposed to it. In order to win over his own party, who had a landslide majority in Parliament, he pushed the United Nations to try and give legitimacy to the invasion. In 2002, the UN passed Resolution 1441, which required Saddam to allow weapon inspectors. Blair then lobbied for a second resolution that permitted an invasion if Saddam did not comply. But France and Russia vetoed this, which made it explicitly clear that the UN did not permit an invasion of Iraq. So why didn't Howard flinch when the UN said that this would be an illegal operation? Well, it's because he absolutely had no regard for their authority. Labour argued that if the UN were to pass that resolution, then they too would be open to the idea of an invasion. For this, Howard says in his book that the Labour Party, consciously or otherwise, had taken a decision effectively to outsource Australia's foreign policy on Iraq to the Russians and the French. So Howard wanted a free trade deal, had been with the Americans on the day of 9/11, and they were already making noises about Iraq at that point, wanted to flex his muscle in response to Bali, and had disdain for the UN Security Council. So when Alexander Downer presented concerns about the rebuilding of Iraq at the hands of America, Howard didn't budge. But there's actually one more reason that is so unbelievably simple. Bush rizzed up Howard. In Howard's book, there's two people who get their own chapter. Pauline Hanson, and that's not for positive reasons, and George Bush. Seriously, this chapter is basically an argument that Bush was a misunderstood genius and a dead-set legend. Howard really disliked Al Gore and later admitted upon Bush's victory that whilst publicly neutral, privately, I had wanted Bush to win. His first phone call with Bush was the day after Don Bradman died, and Bush had done his homework on the matter and had some questions about cricket. Indulge me on one more Howard quote here, but I think it's telling. George Bush displayed intense loyalty to people who stuck by him or shared his values. Likewise, he did not take kindly to people who let him down. Now, in my opinion, Howard is way too intelligent to have the wool pulled over his eyes, but as he writes, it really does seem like he's someone who wants Bush's approval. Howard even bragged that the only city that Bush stayed for 4 consecutive nights in as president was Howard's native Sydney in 2007. To be fair, I also don't know if I could have resisted the rizz of Bush.
We must stop the terror. Now watch this drive.
Now, this has actually been edited together, at least in part, by one of our editors. They started with zero editing skills, but I set up a step-by-step guide for how to do all of this, and look at them go. Seriously, so much of my time is dead time editing that I could easily outsource. With editors, I can produce about 2 to 3 times as many videos, but there's only one way I can have stable enough funding to keep them. I've set up a Patreon tier, and out of the thousands of you watching, if just 50 of you joined, that would secure the short-term future. And if you join, you get access to the same program that they had, where from scratch, I teach you how to make really good and visually clear educational videos. The link's below, and honestly, I am not exaggerating here, it would completely change the future of the channel if you were able to join. It's easy to think that public support for Iraq was high in the beginning and then dipped over time. But it's actually more of a U-shaped graph. Before the war, Howard himself conceded that only 25% of Australians supported an invasion. And so invading Iraq wasn't just a subversion of law, but also a subversion against the will of his own people. You see, unlike the UK, our parliament never had to vote on whether or not to go to war. Whereas Blair had to fight tooth and nail to get some people in his own party to join the Tories in opposition to get a declaration of war through their parliament, Australia's Defence Act meant that the decision was made with Howard and his ministers. When confronted with the fact that the UN opposed an invasion, Howard deferred to something called the Memorandum of Advice, in which his legal team said that the first UN resolution actually gave a justification for an invasion. This was an extreme minority view across the world. I mean, I'm no international lawyer, but how hard is it to look at the second resolution that explicitly asked for an invasion that ended up getting vetoed? But Howard had committed to the invasion. Just days after Downer told him that the rebuild was going to be a huge task, Howard faced another setback. The scheduled invasion intended to sandwich Saddam from both his north and his south. However, Turkey's parliament narrowly voted against the approval of US troops to use their shared border with Iraq to begin the invasion. It was a sign that Bush's coalition of the willing wasn't quite as big as once thought. With America and Britain now both advancing from the south, Britain was responsible for holding the south, while America advanced through to the north to ultimately find and capture Saddam. For the Australians, the SAS were responsible for helping fortify the western desert over here so that the Iraqi army couldn't launch Scud ballistic missiles on the advancing Americans. When the British Marines were securing the Alfour Peninsula, the HMAS Anzac provided them with valuable cover. Now, I'm not kings and generals. War mapping is not my area of expertise. But what you need to know is that just 2 months after the invasion began, Bush gave his famous mission accomplished speech, claiming that Saddam had been defeated and the SAS were now free to return to Perth. In fact, the start had gone so well that public polling on Iraq had improved from 25% at the beginning of the invasion to now 50% in Australia. By the end of the year, Saddam had been captured in northern Iraq, and though it might have been achieved through vigilante justice, it seemed like Iraq might actually just work out. But remember what Alexander Downer said at the beginning of the year. Without legal cover, the rebuild won't work. In other words, unless every other country said that Saddam had to go, then the Iraqis would feel aggrieved that their country was attacked by America and would never allow them specifically to be the ones who rebuilt it. In 2004, the rebuild process began, and Australia's election would be the first litmus test amongst the coalition of the willing. Bush had his election 1 month after Howard, and Blair had his the following year. However, across the aisle from John Howard, Simon Crean actually ended up resigning as Labor leader at the end of 2003. Despite Iraq being initially unpopular, many felt that Crean had failed to effectively prosecute the case against Howard, and with a good set of hands that he had found a way to somehow go backwards in the polls. So enter Mark Latham, and just ignore what we found out about him about a month ago or so. I've staked my reputation on this. Prime 0304 Latham was the closest thing we've had to Paul Keating since he left office.
We have become less safe in the war against terror because of the conflict in Iraq. Why? Because it diverted so many resources from the real task. And for Australia, the real task is in our part of the world, in Asia.
Latham was a more effective critic of the Iraq War, even promising that by Christmas of 2004, he'd have all Australian soldiers back home. Obviously, that was a deeply concerning thing for America to hear. But fortunately for them, Latham was also very erratic and came across as quite unlikable. The Liberals also ran a brilliant scare campaign on interest rates going up under Labor.
How much will an increase in interest rates cost on a $200,000 mortgage? A 0.5% increase? You pay $83 a month extra. And if they rose to the average they were last time Labor were in power, you pay $950 a month extra. And that's after tax. Mark Latham and interest rates? Good luck.
Authorised B.9 Liberal Party, Canberra.
I know it has nothing to do with Iraq, but my goodness, I had to play the full thing. Like the video if you think that L-Plate Latham was the greatest campaign of all time. Howard won an emphatic victory in 2004, and it boded well for both Bush and Blair, who won their respective elections, though Blair took a pretty big hit in 2005. In 2004, Australian Major General Jim Molan was also appointed to be the Chief of Operations in Iraq. For context, General Casey was the leader of the coalition forces, and Molan was just one beneath him, leading 300,000 soldiers as they tried to institute this new government. However, Howard supported Bush in making a fatal mistake in Iraq. They disbanded the Iraqi army. The theory was that the army that they had been fighting against wouldn't just go and support America in rebuilding Iraq, and would actively undermine them at every point along the way. But have a look at this map. In the north are the Kurds. Ethnically, they belong to a group of people that stretch out over here, and they never felt as though they belonged in Iraq. They made up about 24% of the country. To the east are the Shiite Arabs, and they make up about 55% of Iraq. And to the west are the Sunni Arabs, and they make up about 20% of the country, with Saddam Hussein being one of them. Now that Saddam was gone, there was bound to be infighting between the groups. The north felt as though they should have their own country, the east felt as though they should be in power because they were the majority in the country, and the west was now angry that they had lost power. The situation was bad enough by itself, but then add in this. When the Iraqi army was disbanded, 400,000 trained soldiers were now out of a job. When the Shiites won the 2005 election, ex-Iraqi soldiers joined radical Sunni groups to fight against not just the Shiites, but the Americans who had put them in. Gowna was now starting to look like a prophet. As no stockpile of WMDs were found, the optics around Iraq got worse. In fact, in the rebuild process, a number of Australian private security firms were hired to protect both construction workers and also voters in the election, and this led to a number of deaths. At the same time, Australia's military personnel was being used to train the new Iraqi army to fight against the old Iraqi army that was perfectly functional but had now been radicalized. I mean, the obvious question was, what do we actually gain by doing all of this? I mean, Australia wasn't even getting those oil contracts. But that was exactly Howard's point. This was never a war fought to gain anything, but to prevent a much worse occurrence of something like 9/11 from ever happening again. You might have heard the saying that the invasion of Iraq never found Al-Qaeda, but instead created Al-Qaeda. Sunni extremists were a thorn in Saddam's side as much as they were America's.
Even during the Clinton years, Saddam had made entreaties to the US government and said, listen, we can help in this battle against Sunni extremism.
But with Saddam gone, the Sunni extremists could attract a far greater military presence than ever before, luring in thousands of unemployed soldiers. Eventually, it would lead to the creation of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, otherwise known as ISIS. Saddam was executed in 2006, but warned that Iraq was doomed to sectarian violence.
That when it came to understanding Iraq and Iraqis, he knew his country like the back of his hand, and he knew it far better than we.
As the violence continued into 2007, Labor's new leader, Kevin Rudd, made the case that his government would withdraw Australian soldiers in the following year. This time, it was met with a much more receptive audience. Bush's declaration of mission accomplished now seemed like a distant memory, and as Iraq had deteriorated, the threat of terrorism had only increased rather than decreased. I don't think that Iraq was the main reason why Howard lost in 2007, but it certainly didn't help his case. I'd be curious to know what you actually think. How much of Australia's involvement in Iraq was directly down to Howard himself? Rudd indeed won the 2007 election in a landslide and proceeded to withdraw from Iraq. But here's what's interesting. The US had been keeping tabs on Labor since Latham's Home by Christmas promise in 2004. Bush's ambassador to Australia wrote a detailed profile home and relied on the testimony of an important person within Labor who wished to have his identity protected. That same person was actually instrumental in the Labor Party getting rid of Kevin Rudd in 2010. Unfortunately for him, in the same year, his identity got leaked. Click here to watch the video where I go through the conspiracy that the US got rid of Kevin Rudd in 2010, and forewarning, I believe it's a true conspiracy.